All right, class. Then we start again. Part two of Engaging Minds, which was the required reading for last week. Again, I want to thank the group for doing such a wonderful, wonderful job. Like the first group as well. It was engaging, full, and it generated a lot of discussions. So I want to recap maybe a few points to take away from as we move into the third and last part this week. Okay, so let me recap one thing that I did not finish as an idea or as a thinking is a distinction that I started with in video one between education and schooling. And so we said ex ducere, meaning to lead out of and to lead to. Um, that is what's known as education, right? Um, uh, and we know that historically speaking, most educated, in other words, knowledgeable people that we ever had in history never went to school. So that's the reason why we're making a distinction between education and schooling. So education is about the process of learning, being, and acknowledging one's ontology or existence in the world, whereas schooling is going to a place called the school. The interesting thing is, most of our education happens outside the school. Some of our education happen inside the school, but the majority of our learning and education happens outside the school. So that's the first distinction that we need to make. The second thing that just kind of linking part one and part A and part B of Engaging Minds is if teaching is as part one argues, if teaching is in part rendering the familiar strange, that's how the very definition of teaching is. It's rendering the familiar strange. If that's the definition, then part B, which is about learning, is, and you see this on page 80 of in the book, is quote a constant restructuring of internal relations in order to maintain sufficient coherence, end quote. That means learning is simply about putting the pieces together so that something makes sense. That's really what learning is about. It's about trying to understand things or understand them differently. Okay, so the two things happening at the same time. So if you want to understand something, that is learning. But sometimes you want to, as you try to understand it, you end up understand it differently. As a result, the part two is making us think about complicated and complex. So the complex is coming from something called, as the chapter argues, one of the chapters explains, coming from complexity theory, which is basically that learning happens in such a that it requires sometimes complicated mechanism. In other words, a mechanization of the learning itself. So learning, as the chapter, one of the chapters argues, learning is always complex because it requires a lot of things at the same time. But part of that complexity is complicated approaches. That is the mechanism of the learning itself, which is in part in introducing the last part, which is about teaching of the book. So what renders, so we know learning is always complex. Complex meaning internally requires a lot of things all at once at the same time. and it requires pulling a lot of strings at the same time as well. Whereas complicated, meaning it's the mechanics that is the ways in which we end up learning. So and as a result, to understand the idea of learning, this part dealt with three let's call them learning theories. Okay, kind of almost summarizing the idea of the learning theories as we understand them in psychology. The first one, which is around the 1950s and 60s, known as behaviorism, which is everybody knows, right? So you condition people. You get I'm going to give you a prize if you get an A. So that becomes kind of a behavior conditioned response, okay? Then moving into around almost late 70s, 80s, and a lot of the 90s, moving into the second style of learning, or and it's really interesting that the part two or part B of the book deals with learning theories not as learning theories but as learning preferences. So it's a very interesting idea in terms of what is our preference in terms of learning. So sometimes so they started with behaviorism, then we moved to the second style or learning theory, which is about constructionism. Constructionism is basically saying that we learned we co-learn. So we're not passive learners. Our minds requires a lot of activities to understand something. So we construct knowledge. So knowledge is not absorbed, knowledge is constructed, hence the idea of constructionism. That idea is taken up a little bit further by the third style of learning, or theory of learning, which is critical theory, and also known as critical pedagogy, where learning is not an individualized act, is not just totally a kind of psychological process, purely psychological. In fact, a lot of our learning is happens socially. So learning for critical theory or critical pedagogy is a social event. So it's not just an individualized and psychological event, but more significantly, it is mostly for this theory out of culture, out of learning, out of a particular context, out of particular families and parents, and so on and so forth. So all of these factors play a direct role in how we learn. As well. So to recap, if teaching is about rendering the familiar strange, learning then it's about putting the pieces together in such a way that they become meaningful. And here we need to distinguish complex, the learning theories. They can be grouped under these groupings. There's a different theories. So the first grouping we might call behaviorism, the second grouping constructionism, and the third is critical pedagogy or critical theory. And especially when it comes to critical theory, there are different ways of learning. So the impact, the book dealt with the impact of technology, the impact of how we read, how we write, where we read, and where we write, and so on and so forth. All of these factors play a role in our style of learning. The book talks about this technology, reading, writing, and all of this as learning forms. And so the forms that we learn through. I really like Natalie's diagram where she dealt with the inclusion, the exclusion, the segregation, and integration. So it was a really nice visual way to see not only complex and complicated, but the learning theories themselves manifesting themselves. Sarir's IQ test is a perfect example of the problem with what we call IQ. Um, so what Sarir was alluding to in her comments that it was American based is something that constantly being critiqued about the IQ, in that it eschews and kind of puts aside marginalized forms of knowledge, marginalized histories, and deals with primarily dominant history and dominant forms of knowledge. So the IQ, one of the major critique of the IQ is that it is not inclusive enough, if at all. So that's kind of my overall comment. I want to commend the group for their style of engaging the class and how we all managed to be part of the discussion. It was really, really wonderful, and I'm really delighted to see that engagement. I would, from some of you, I would like to see actually more participation. Okay, and I shall talk soon. Cheers. Bye.